What I want to talk about today is World War II and the real causes of World War II versus the mythical sort of narrative that we often get in the West, which is this narrative that communism and Nazism are equally bad, and actually there was an alliance between the Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany, right? Even though the Soviet Union dealt 80% of German casualties during World War II, even though the Soviet Union did the brunt of the fighting, even though the Soviet Union lost 27 million citizens in the fighting against the Nazis in World War II. Westerners and Americans and bourgeois propagandists will still say that because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, because of this peace agreement that obviously didn't last between Germany and the Soviet Union, that means that Stalin and Hitler were buddies. Stalin and Hitler were allies. Germany and the Soviet Union were tight. They were like this before they went to war and killed millions of each other. But that's obviously not true. As we've said many times on the show, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was basically a way for Stalin and the Soviet Union to buy time, to try and push back the war further so they could build up their military capacity and build up their industry. And actually, the Soviet Union had plans to go into Germany and take out Hitler before he was able to rise to power, before he was able to stop World War II. But a lot of the Western powers weren't on board with that because they had too many business interests in Germany. They were making too much money in Germany. There were too many Ford plants in Germany, making money for Henry Ford and his corporation. So this myth that we get about the Soviet Union and Hitler being buddies is a Western dogma that the only evidence they have for it is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But some of the videos we're going to go into today are going to explain how ridiculous that myth is. So the first one I want to play is from Guerrilla History. This is a really cool Marxist podcast. I'm not sure who runs it. Brett O'Shea of Rev Left Radio might be part of it. I don't know. I know that they have some sort of connection to Rev Left Radio, but either way, they tweeted out this clip from their podcast. This is false, utilizing, and this is in response to Paul Massaro, who's one of the biggest anti-communist Ukraine simps on the internet. If he's not a Fed, I would be shocked. But they say, Paul Massaro said, 84 years since the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Never forget that Russia and Germany started World War II together as allies. So Paul Massaro here repeating that exact myth that I just laid out for you. This myth that because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Russia and Germany were allies, even though, the world owes Russia a great debt because they did the brunt of the fighting against Germany in World War II. Idiot Fed Westerners like Paul Massaro will still try and portray Russia and Germany as if they were buddies, as if they were friends, as if socialism and fascism are the same thing. But nothing could be farther from the truth. And Guerrilla History responded, or this person responded with a clip from Guerrilla History saying, this is false. Utilizing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as a means to beat communists over the head is a commonly used canard by both liberals and conservatives. It disregards a lot of history, though. Yes, it does what bourgeois historians always do. It isolates something in history like the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact while ignoring all the different factors, all the historical context, all the history that led up to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, all the history that followed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, so that they can say the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were the same. Full stop. Sorry, I had it muted.
Push back on the characterization of like Molotov-Ribbentrop. It would have been nice to push back and say, hey, there were previous attempts between the Soviet Union and Western Europe before that pact was signed, like April 16th, 1939. There was a direct proposal from the Soviet Union to have a military pact with France and the UK to directly oppose, Nazi Germany. This is 4 months before Molotov-Ribbentrop is signed. And that goes beyond, Western powers were also signing pacts with Nazi Germany at the time. Four Powers Pact, 1933. That was UK, France, Italy, and Germany. Anglo-German Naval Agreement, 1935, UK and Germany. German-British Non-Aggression Pact, 38. German-French Non-Aggression Pact, 38. Like, I mean, there was a lot of these things, but it seems like we dwell on Molotov-Ribbentrop, so that would have been something that I would have liked to push back on.
So very good there. It's Battle Cossack. Thank you so much for the super chat from Argentina. Appreciate you as always. But exactly what Battle Cossack said here is what they said in the podcast. The path was to buy time for the Soviet Union to build up their military capacity because Britain and France wouldn't join the USSR in the fight against the Nazis. They waited till the absolute last minute, until the Soviets were already, engaged in a brutal war with Germany. Thank you so much, Battle Cossack, for that super chat. I appreciate you. And I put the link to this tweet in the chat so you guys can go and boost it if you have an X account, if you have a Twitter account, because Paul Massaro is one of the biggest idiots and one of the biggest bourgeois propagandists on Twitter. He's constantly getting a lot of likes and attention for some of the dumbest, most brain-dead, foolish takes I've ever seen in my life. And he'll actually delete them if they're proven wrong, especially his takes about Ukraine. He'll say the most ridiculous stuff, make the most ridiculous predictions, and then when they don't come true, a month later, he'll delete them. So go boost this tweet so we can show people how much of a fool Paul Massaro is. But this little clip here reminded me of this talk from the man himself, Michael Parenti, about the real causes of World War II. This is one of my favorite Parenti clips of all time. And here he's going to go even more in depth than the Guerrilla History podcast did there.
For Real History, a series of talks by me about important and controversial themes in history, many of which have been buried or ignored by those who control our intellectual environment.
Battle Cossack with another super chat. Thank you, Battle Cossack. Really appreciate that. All of our funding at the Institute, the Midwestern Marx Institute, comes from the viewers. We have no exterior funding. We have no billionaires dumping money into our institute. So every dollar you guys give us is extremely helpful. So appreciate you. I would say HistoryTube is probably worse. At this point, there are literally accounts like Kings and Generals who have their scripts being written for them by people like Turgut Gambar, who's one of the main social media department heads at the NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is basically a CIA cutout. He's writing the scripts for a lot of these animated history accounts that are pretending to teach objective history, but are actually teaching neoliberal history that's riddled with myths and selectively chosen facts that make the West look good, make the Soviet Union look bad. So I'd say HistoryTube is worse at this point.
Those who control our vision of the past exercise a preeminent control over how we see the present and the future. The usual explanations for World War II are the following. Hitler was a maniac and bent on world conquest, and nothing could stop him. Second, the West tried to avoid war by appeasing him. Third, the Soviet Union entered into an unholy alliance with Hitler in the Hitler-Stalin Pact and collaborated and made possible for him to have his successes. I want to show that all three of these statements are misleading and in some respects downright false in their implications. Let's begin with the first one. Hitler could have been stopped. He was not unstoppable, and there were powerful forces in the German army itself that were ready to stop him. In 1930...
Has anyone seen the movie Valkyrie with Tom Cruise? That's actually a movie about one of these uprisings within the German armed forces that aimed to take Hitler out, but ultimately failed.
Hitler unilaterally scrapped the Versailles Peace Treaty that limited Germany to 7 divisions. He began a major mobilization of 21 divisions. He then told his generals he was going to move toward 36 divisions. His generals were stunned. 7 divisions was woefully inadequate, but this was a mobilization for another total war in Europe. In 1937, Hitler told his general staff that indeed he planned war against France, Poland, and Russia, and it would come sometimes within the next 6 years. In fact, it came within 2 years. Again, Hitler's generals were absolutely flabbergasted about this and really concerned. Another war, a total war against all of Europe, was one that would bring the inevitable defeat and destruction of Germany. Well, what happened was a concerted conspiracy was begun by the German General Staff to kill Hitler and remove the Nazis from power. The Wehrmacht, the German army, would surround and move against the Nazi SS divisions. Key commanders would move their divisions in place and take over the Nazi elite forces. A special commando unit would be set up to storm Hitler's headquarters and kill him. The generals did not see how Germany could fight 2 million French, the entire Polish army, and the small but powerful Czechoslovakian army, not to mention the British, who would be joining in inevitably. To save Germany, they decided to move against Hitler, but they got no cooperation from the West. In 1936, Hitler violated the Versailles Peace Treaty by remilitarizing the Rhineland. England and France did nothing to stop him. Hitler said England and France would do nothing to stop. His generals said it was too risky to move into the Rhineland. England and France proved Hitler right. In 1938,
But I thought it was the Soviet Union who helped Hitler. I thought it was the Soviet Union who was buddy-buddy with Hitler. Now you're telling me that the French and the British could have stopped Hitler before he started World War II, but they didn't?
The generals were about to strike. Much of the German general staff was involved. They hated Adolf Hitler. They hated the way the Nazis had treated the German military staff. I counted about 60 or so senior officers who were eventually executed by the Nazis or arrested or died one way or the other when these plans were eventually exposed. So they were ready to move again, but Hitler annexed Austria, and the Western leaders did nothing, and the plans to do in Hitler had to be postponed. They were temporarily politically impossible because Hitler was triumphing so much. The Western allies gave him Austria on a platter. It was hard to convince people that Hitler was destroying Germany when in fact he seemed to be empowering Germany. Later that same year, in September 1938...
I mean, that makes perfect sense. If the West and the Western powers are just letting Hitler take more and more land and do more and more, and the generals who are saying, you can't do this, France and the UK are going to intervene, are being proven wrong, it makes sense that empowered Hitler in Germany. Whereas if the French and the UK had intervened directly, if they had put a stop to what Hitler was doing or tried to, back these generals who wanted to oust Hitler from power, it would have been very different. And it's so interesting that the West is so eager to coup governments that they don't like, to coup any government that goes against their economic interests. Just 20 years after this, the U.S. had no problem cooing Jacobo Arbenz when he wanted to redistribute United Fruit Company land to the people. They had no problem backing sectors of his military and Carlos Castillo Armas to oust him from power. But when it comes to literally Hitler, literally the leader of Nazi Germany, no, we can't do a coup to him. That would be undemocratic. Let's just let him keep doing whatever he wants until he almost destroys the world.
War loomed inevitably. It seemed inevitable again. A war that the German generals believed they could not win. Hitler was laying claim to the entire western industrial base of Czechoslovakia, known as the Sudetenland. It was time to act. To destroy Hitler or Germany would be destroyed, was the thinking among the German general staff. And by the way, not just with the German military, but with other elements in the Abwehr, which was the German secret intelligence, not the Nazi Gestapo, not the Nazi party, but the government group and a number of other groups. There were people who felt that Hitler had to be stopped. They were themselves all pretty much conservatives, by the way. By mid-September, the conspirators believed they had the pistol cocked and ready, aimed at the head of state. All that was needed was the order to pull the trigger. The trigger pulling would be initiated by Hitler himself when he announced publicly his intention to seize Czechoslovakia by force. And the hammer would fly forward when the British and French handed down their decision to go to war over the principle of safeguarding the integrity of small nations. Beck believed this is what they would do. Beck was the German general who was in charge of the conspiracy. The Czechoslovakian people believed that the British and French would do the very same thing, At that same time, Hitler ordered a panzer division with supporting infantry to parade through Berlin. The crowd stood sullenly and watched them pass. This is Mason's description, by the way. It's a very interesting point. He notes that the Fuhrer had hoped for enthusiasm. Watching the apathetic reaction from a chancellery window, he was disgusted. He turned away and he said to an adjutant, "I can't wage a war yet with people like this." In other words, the German people were not all that gung-ho about war. They had just had a bitter and terrible war just 17 years before, and they remember the hardships and the loss and whatever else. So Hitler did not have mass support for war, much outside his party. Well, the German generals were ready to move against Hitler if he struck against Czechoslovakia and led to an impossible war. But once again, British Prime Minister Chamberlain came to Hitler's rescue. The Czechs were ready to fight. The Soviet Union was ready to fight and said it would join Czechoslovakia in the war against Hitler.
What? The Soviet Union said they would join Czechoslovakia in the war against Hitler? But I thought the Soviet Union and Germany entered World War II as allies. That's what Paul Massaro just said on Twitter, this guy who pretends to be a political and historical expert. All these Western historical experts told me that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact means they were best friends, right? But here, if we look at the actual history, it was the Soviet Union who was ready to step in at the earliest and put a stop to Hitler's march. And it was the Western powers who kept letting Hitler grow in power and influence and seize more and more and more territory. This is really interesting. Look at this from Unparalleled Dev. 1933, Pact of Four. 1934, Hitler-Pilsudsko Pact. 1935, Naval Pact. 1936, Anti-Comintern Pact. 1938, UK Non-Aggression Pact. 1938, France Non-Aggression Pact. 1939, Romania Economic Pact. Look at all these peace deals that were signed with Hitler before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact by Western countries. But these liars like Paul Massaro, these lying bourgeois Western historians, just isolate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to say, look, the Soviet Union and Germany were best friends, when nothing could be further from the truth. When, as Parenti saying, the Soviet Union was ready to step in before any of the Western countries, and all of the Western countries had very similar pacts to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They were also trying to avoid another world war. So these people who isolate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in history to say that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were best friends are morons. They're either morons or they're purposefully lying to you by removing all of the historical context from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to just focus on this one event and demonize the Soviet Union. Selective history. I like your profile picture, by the way, Marcus.
The Union made repeated overtures to Great Britain and France and Poland and Czechoslovakia for a joint military pact, security pact against Hitler, that if he attacked any one of them, he would be attacked by all of them. But the British and French refused to join such a pact. Instead, the British and French hurried to Munich and gave Hitler the Sudetenland. The German general plan was collapsed. There was going to be no threat of war. There was going to be no danger to Germany. There was going to be no reason to move against Hitler. The conspirators pulled back. Czechoslovakia was not even allowed to attend Munich. It was at the Munich conference that Chamberlain gave Hitler Czechoslovakia, and that was the beginning of the end of the peace. 5 months later, Hitler moved in and took all of Czechoslovakia. By the way, even after Munich, the Soviet Union offered to stand with Czechoslovakia, even offering to send troops and planes. The Soviets, however, were denied passage to Czechoslovakia by Poland. Poland was a right-wing military dictatorship, and Poland thereby did its small part in the digging of its own grave. Let's take the second explanation, that Great Britain and France appeased Hitler.
Reminds me of Poland today backing the Banderite Nazis in Ukraine every step of the way.
And this is what led to the war. They proved weak and had no backbone. Well, they were war-weary and they were unwilling to fight. They were willing to take peace at any price. That's really not quite true. They had been war-weary after World War I, and yet they proved themselves very willing to fight. Right after World War I, British and French and 12 other nations sent expeditionary forces to invade and fight in Soviet Russia, as it was still called then, to overthrow the Russian Revolution. So they were quite ready to fight if it was to fight communists. They were not ready to fight the fascists. They were reluctant to confront Germany even when it was weak and could have been stopped in 1935 when it had only about 7 or 10 divisions. They had wind that the German generals were wavering. They had wind that there was a very serious conspiracy afoot. The British intelligence heard from the Abwehr, the German secret service, secret intelligence. The Abwehr tried to feed London secret information on the Nazi buildup. Chamberlain was not interested. Chamberlain failed to respond to all overtures from the anti-Nazi Germans, even high-placed ones who commanded divisions of troops, even conservative ones. In other words, I believe Chamberlain was not an appeaser. He was an active collaborator of Adolf Hitler's.
So why doesn't Paul Massaro talk about that? Why don't these Western historians talk about that? Why don't they talk about Chamberlain collaborating with Hitler? Why don't they talk about the West handing Czechoslovakia over to Hitler? Well, because that makes the West look bad, because the truth makes the Western imperialist powers look bad, and it makes the Soviet Union look good. And these liars, these propagandists, these deceivers of the public like Paul Massaro want to do the opposite. They want to demonize the Soviet Union. They want to demonize Russia. They want to demonize communism. They want to demonize the millions of Soviet soldiers The millions of our comrades who gave their lives defeating the Nazi menace, ridding the world of the plague that was Hitler and his Nazi party. They want to demonize them for that and make it seem like the West is the only reason that the Allied powers won World War II. And they want to make it seem like the Soviet Union was buddy-buddy with Hitler. So they choose the most selective facts possible to make their narrative, and their narrative is the complete opposite of what actually happened.
They actively encouraged Hitler's policy. On Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain himself threatened Czechoslovakia if the Czechs failed to accept Munich. He threatened to freeze their assets. He would deny them all materials if they decided to stand up alone against Germany. And he handed over all Czech assets in England to Adolf Hitler when Hitler took over all of Czechoslovakia. He engaged in the active participation and dismemberment of Czechoslovakia and handed it over to the Nazis on a platter. Chamberlain saw Hitler and Nazism as a bulwark against communism in Germany. And he saw Nazi Germany as a bulwark against communism in Europe. With a few exceptions like Winston Churchill, Western leaders...
Why don't they talk about that? Why don't they talk about the fact that the liberal imperialists would rather have Nazism and fascism than communism? Right? We always hear that communist governments and fascist governments are the same. They're both totalitarian. We've heard that ever since Hannah Arendt wrote that garbage book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. Why doesn't anyone ever talk about the connection between liberalism and fascism? Right? Because if you look at the actual history, it seems like fascism and communism are diametrically opposed. The Soviet Union was the country that did most of the fighting against the Nazis, whereas the liberal countries only entered the war at the last minute when they were forced to. So why don't we ever talk about the close relationship between liberalism and fascism? Or why don't we talk about the fact that fascism always appears when capitalism and liberalism is in decay? Why don't we talk about the fact that communism crushed fascism in Germany and in other places around the world? Well, because that doesn't fit the West's narrative. The West has to lie and claim that communism and fascism are both two sides of the same coin, two sides of this made-up concept called totalitarianism, and they were buddy-buddy because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And it's just a lie, dude. It's just an absolute myth. It's just ahistorical bullshit. And it's so disgusting. And Michael Parenti is such a hero for spending his entire life fighting against the frauds in his field. The Western bourgeois propagandists who call themselves historians, but are nothing but bourgeois reactionary ideologues and disgusting liars. People like Paul Massaro
were more concerned with the Bolshevik specter than with the fascist reality. They were uneasy about Hitler's emergent power, but they didn't look upon fascism with the same loathing and fear that they did communism. Unlike the communists, the fascists were not a threat to private enterprise. If anything, the fascists had crushed socialist organizations in Germany and Italy and had made these countries safer for private capital. Now, to be sure, Chamberlain and his associates were eager to avoid war. They didn't want war, but much of that eagerness arose not from some kind of pacifism and commitment to peace, or peace at any price, but from a willingness to strike the kind of bargain with a Nazi leader that they would never dream of entering into with the Soviets. The British historian Geoffrey Barakoff argued, quote, Hitler's successes in foreign policy would do less to German rearmament, the deficiencies and limitations of which were known to competent military circles, than to the tacit alliance of powerful reactionary elements in England and France, which, although loath to see a reassertion of German equality, were still more unwilling to check it by military alliance with Soviet Russia or to run the risk of social revolution in Germany as a result of Hitler's fall. In other words, I'm not saying that Chamberlain necessarily loved Hitler, although there were plenty of leaders in the West who did. There was all sorts of people in America. Henry Ford was an open Nazi admirer, and a number of other American plutocrats, and a number of people in England also. But Chamberlain's feeling was, if I had to choose between Nazism and Hitler, or the risk, even the risk of Soviet influence in Germany, then we will take Nazism. They could much better live with the reality, the horrible reality of fascism, than with the future imagined risk of socialism. Western leaders never really quite reconciled.
They would rather live with the reality of fascism than the imagined risk of socialism. So true. So true. They would support fascism every step of the way if it helped them prevent the potential of socialism. And people act like the US supporting Nazis in Ukraine is something new. Like the US hasn't been supporting far-right ethno-nationalist groups forever. What do you think the Contras in Nicaragua were? What do you think those far right-wing paramilitary death squads were? They were fascists. They were fascists, and the U.S. helped those fascists in Nicaragua sell crack cocaine and flooded majority black neighborhoods with crack cocaine here in the U.S. Got all the poor people in the U.S. and all the black potential revolutionaries hooked on crack in order to fund these fascist movements in Nicaragua to try and stop the Sandinistas from gaining power. They would rather support the fascists, the right-wing paramilitary death squads, than even risk the potential of having a socialist Nicaragua, rather than even give socialists the chance to gain a foothold in Nicaragua. They would support the reality of fascism over the potential of socialism any freaking day. That is such a good quote. But the Sandinistas still got that dub, though. Nice try, Reagan, you piece of shit.
Themselves to the existence of a socialist Russia. And they, at the same time, they did fear Germany's growing strength. So their strategy was to turn Hitler's aggression against the USSR. So it wasn't appeasement. Chamberlain went to Munich because he had a plan. And that plan was to give Hitler what he wanted and then send Hitler east to attack Bolshevik Russia. After all, Chamberlain and his party had just attacked Bolshevik Russia. Let's see, we're talking 1939. They had just been there just 18 years before, 1921, invading Russia and trying to stop the revolution. By the way, this was not an altogether unrealistic plan. Given the rabid anti-communism and anti-Sovietism professed by the Nazi leaders, they were quite ready, and they talked about moving east, you know. The commander-in-chief of the French armed forces, General Gamelin, wrote in his memoirs that one of the aims of the Anglo-French alliance was to bring about a clash between German and Soviet interests. Harry Truman had made that famous statement. We ought to let Hitler and Stalin fight each other until they totally exhaust each other and bleed each other white. Now, in Asia, the United States and Great Britain has had something of the same plan. They did very little to deter Japanese aggressions in Manchuria and China. And here, too, the anticipation was that the Japanese might move against the Soviet Union. And so they were willing to give them a free hand, just as they were willing to give Hitler a free hand in Central Europe, in Austria and Czechoslovakia. And by the way, this is exactly what happened. In 1938, the Japanese militarists entered an alliance with Germany and Italy. It was called the Anti-Comintern Pact. The Comintern was the Communist International, made up of International Association of Communist Parties, which were heavily under the influence and hegemony.
Wait, hold on. I thought the Soviet Union was best friends with Germany, though. Paul Massaro in the NED told me that the Soviet Union was best friends with the fascists. But you're telling me the fascists entered into an anti-Comintern pact? They entered into a pact that was explicitly anti-communist, an alliance against communism? Have these Western bourgeois historians been lying to me? No.
Of the Soviet Communist Party. The Anti-Comintern Pact, an alliance of three fascist nations, Japan, Germany, and Italy, and they vowed a joint struggle against world communism. The Japanese then attacked the Soviet Union that same year near the Outer Mongolia area, leading to a full-scale war that ended with Japan's suffering 18,000 casualties and military defeat. During all this time, by the way, American corporations continued to expand their investments in German heavy industry, including arms productions.
And now we see why the Westerners didn't want to do anything about Germany. I mean, for one, it was a bulwark against communism. They wanted the fascists to fight their communist enemies in the Soviet Union. But they were also expanding their business interests in Germany, because even though people like to claim that fascist Germany was socialist, it absolutely wasn't. The term privatization was actually coined in Nazi Germany because they were taking all the state-owned industries and selling it off to different multinationals and different business interests. They were privatizing the country, which allowed people like Henry Ford to make a lot of money in Germany. So Western business interests didn't want to take out Hitler. Hitler was doing fine by them. He was allowing them to accumulate profits. He was taking industries that were owned by the government, owned by the state, and giving them away to private interests. Why would they have a problem with Germany? And during World War II, they actually they would use American manufacturing plants as bomb shelters because they knew that the U.S. would never bomb their own capital.
We're talking about corporations like Ford Motor Company and General Motors. Now let's move to the third proposition, that the Hitler-Stalin Pact, or the Nazi-Soviet Pact, the most talked about treaty in history. By the way, it's still regularly referred to in the U.S. media at every opportunity.
We'll play a little bit of part 2 here.
Of the devils, about how Hitler and Stalin met and made this alliance. Munich, by the way, is never described as the Hitler-Chamberlain Pact or the Nazi-British Pact, which it was. It's always antiseptically called Munich. Well,
Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? How they changed the name to try and make it seem like something different. Let's start calling it the Chamberlain Nazi Pact, the British Nazi Pact. I like that better than Munich.
It said the Soviet Union had made repeated overtures to conclude collective security pacts with the United States and Great Britain in order to contain both German and Japanese aggression. These overtures were repeatedly ignored or rebuffed, including the Soviet attempts to render armed assistance to Czechoslovakia. In time, Soviet leaders lost what little confidence they had had in the sincerity and ultimate purposes of the Western democracies. It was evident that had Hitler at this time struck directly at Russia, he would have encountered very little, if any, opposition from France or Britain. As the historian Foster A. Dulles notes, the American government and Great Britain and France had an attitude which was to do nothing to free the Soviet Union from its anxieties regarding Hitler's crusade against communism. If it were impossible to crush Nazi aggression by a united front, Stalin felt the next best thing for Russia was to attempt to divert any immediate German attack from the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1939, the Soviets made frantic efforts to enter into negotiations with Western leaders, French and British leaders. French and British sent a delegation by boat to Moscow, which took a week. When they arrived, they had no protocol papers. And the question came up is, where are your papers? Who do you represent? Can you negotiate with state authority? It became clear during that summer that a stall was underway. So what in fact happened is that Stalin began to make overtures with the Nazis. Isolated by the West, frustrated in its last-minute attempts to form...
So only after repeated efforts by the West to ally with Nazi Germany or turn Nazi Germany against the Soviets, and the Western powers repeatedly rejecting these efforts to take out Hitler before he launched World War II. Only after that did Stalin look to make a peace agreement. Did Stalin look to prevent his country from being invaded by the Nazi forces. And that is what the liars and bourgeois propagandists like Paul Massaro take out of context to say that Stalin and Hitler were best buddies. Do you see how absurd it is? Do you see how much of a myth this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact nonsense that we always hear is? You know, a myth that's been repeated by our old buddy Prax Ben on TikTok a million times. It's always saying Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, as if it's an own, right? When you say that, anybody who knows the real history can automatically dismiss you as an idiot or a liar, right? If you believe that Hitler and Stalin were best buddies in the lead up to World War II, you either don't know what you're talking about or you're a propagandist and a liar. Because there were far more peace agreements between the Western powers and the Nazis before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was ever signed. And the Soviet Union was eager to do something about Hitler, but the West was not, because their business interests were making too much money in Germany and because they wanted to use the Nazis as a bulwark against communism. And at that point, Stalin attempted to stave off the war through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But let's just isolate it from its historical context. Let's just talk about this fact while disconnecting it from all the factors and the historical preconditions that allowed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact or brought the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact into existence. That's how the liberal and bourgeois historians always do it. They always do it. And Marx talks about this in depth in the German ideology. He says they don't look at the preconditions and the historical factors that cause an event to exist. They isolate things from their historical context. They just take one event, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, isolate it from all its context and the things that happened after that, and use it to push whatever narrative they want. Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Hitler and Stalin were best friends. It's the mode of bourgeois history. This is how they interpret history, and this is how they're able to spin these myths and these stories and get the public to believe these myths that are nonsense, that have, you know, Americans thinking that the Soviet Union and the Nazis were best friends when 27 million of our comrades from the Soviet Union died fighting Nazi Germany. And it's so disrespectful to it. It's so disgusting that these people like Paul Massaro and these Western historians spit on the memory and spit on the grave of the 27 million heroic Soviet citizens and soldiers who died fighting Nazi Germany by trying to say that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were best friends. No, the liberals, the liberal imperialists tried being best friends with Hitler until they couldn't anymore. You liars.
An anti-Nazi alliance with Great Britain and France, and I would point out the Soviet Union was the only country in 1936, 7, and 8 that was the only major country that was trying to form an anti-Nazi alliance. And believing that it was being set up as a target for Hitler's aggression, and they believed correctly, the Soviets decided to sign an 11th-hour non-aggression treaty with Hitler in the summer of 1939. To this day, the conservatives talk about this diabolic affinity between the Nazis and the communists for signing this pact. Conservative news columnist George Will would write, the 1939 Nazi-Soviet pact truly was a joining of kindred spirits. On another
Cobra says, without the genius of Stalin, we'd all be speaking German right now. And yeah, people who follow the gaming stream, which, you know, follow Midwestern Marks on Twitch and Eddie Lagersmith Gaming on YouTube if you want to be part of that. But some guy was like mocking us for supporting Stalin the other day, or acting like it was the most insane thing ever, which is what a lot of Americans do. But, you know, and I get that we need to be practical and we're not going to win over American workers by holding up banners of Stalin. Right? But there's truth and there's not truth, right? And the truth is that Stalin did everything he could to defeat Nazi Germany, and he was extremely successful in doing so. And without the industrialization policies of Joseph Stalin, and without the leadership of Joseph Stalin leading the first workers' state, the Nazis very well, it's very likely that the Nazis would have won, that they would have taken Russia, and that they would have, you know, continued their expansion and tried to take over the entire world, or turn the rest of the European countries into basically colonies that they could super exploit. Right? So yeah, I'm going to defend Stalin against the lies of the bourgeoisie. The truth is the freaking truth. And I know it's not popular. I really don't care. There's facts and there's lies. And the bourgeois history and the bourgeois narratives and the bourgeois myths that we get all the time, that so much of our population believes, are terrible lies. It just is what it is. They've thrown so much crap and so many myths on Stalin's grave. When he wasn't a perfect leader, nobody's a perfect leader, but the world owes the dude a great debt of gratitude. And especially the 27 million Soviets who gave their lives fighting the Nazis. To act like they were just the same, that they were just the same as Hitler, get the hell out of here, you scumbags, you liars.
On another occasion, George Will described the Soviet Union as a regime that was, quote, once allied with Hitler. In fact, the Soviet Union was never...
We don't hold up banners of Stalin in public, just kiss posters in our bedroom before we go to bed. Exactly, yes. Yes.
Allied with Nazi Germany. The pact was a treaty, but it wasn't an alliance. It no more indicated an alliance with Nazism than would a non-aggression treaty between the United States and the Soviets.
American popular culture has turned Stalin into a cartoon character. Parenti was my first introduction to the real Stalin. I won't lie, I was skeptical at first, but time has vindicated him. Yes, exactly. I was the same way. And this is, you know, why I don't think that we should hold up banners of Stalin or the DPRK or whatever, because I understand people have been taught that he's an evil murderer and an evil monster. So it takes time to unpack these myths in people's heads and tell them the truth. But the more you study it, the more you read about it, the more you look at the Soviet archives, or people who have written on the Soviet archives like Grover Furr, the more you hear from real historians like Michael Parenti, the more you realize that the bourgeois propagandists have been lying about Stalin. Then it makes sense. Of course they would lie about Stalin. He was the leader of the first workers' state. He was the leader of the first socialist country. Of course they're going to pile a bunch of nonsense and lies on his grave. Right? I was the same way, especially with the DPRK when I first turned to socialism. I'm like, there's no way North Korea isn't an evil dictatorial hellhole where they torture their people and force their people into labor camps. But the more research you do, the more you're like, holy shit, I've been lied to about everything.
Indicate a U.S. alliance with communism. The Pact was neither an alliance nor an agreement for the partition of Poland. Now, Munich had been a true alliance for partition. The British and the French dictated partition to the Czechs. They said, you obey, this is what's going to happen, and you better toe the line, and the Germans are taking you over. The Soviet government undertook no such action against the Poles. They merely promised to remain neutral, which is what the Poles had always asked them to do anyway. The Poles did not want to enter an alliance with the Soviets against the Germans. More than this, the agreement was, in the last resort, anti-German because it limited the German advance eastward in case of war. This is what Winston Churchill emphasized. With the Pact, the Soviets hoped to ward off what they most dreaded, a united capitalist attack on Soviet Russia. And really, it was difficult to see what other course Soviet Russia could have followed. Ideally, they wanted the grand alliance with the West against the Nazis. But barring that, they turned the tables and made a pact with Hitler. When Hitler attacked Poland, the Soviets moved into Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, the Baltic territories that had been taken from them by Germany, Britain, and Poland in 1919. They overthrew the right-wing dictatorships that were in those countries. By the way, today we ought to remember when we hear about Lithuania going back to its democracy, that Lithuania wasn't a democracy. They were right-wing dictatorships that the Western counter-revolutionaries had installed in the Baltic states. The three states were incorporated as three republics into the USSR. The Soviets also took back Western Belarus, the Western Ukraine, and other areas seized from them and incorporated into the Polish right-wing dictatorship in 1921 under the Treaty of Riga. This has been portrayed as proof that they colluded with the Nazis to gobble up Poland, but the Soviets reoccupied only the area that had been taken from them 20 years before. History offers few, if any, examples of a nation refusing the opportunity to regain territory that had been seized from it. In any case, by reclaiming their old boundaries, the Soviets did draw a line on the Nazi advance. Even after Hitler attacked Poland and Great Britain and France declared war on Germany, the Western collaboration did not end. And this is a part of the history that's not known, never mentioned by George Will, never mentioned by commentators today, and not mentioned by many historians either. When Hitler struck east into Poland, nothing happened on the Western Front. Now, don't forget, Great Britain and France had just declared war. There were still feelers from London and Paris about making a separate peace with Hitler so that he could concentrate on Soviet Russia. From September 1939, when World War II began, to May of 1940, about 8 months, there was no fighting between Germany and the Western Allies, even though they were at war with each other. The French began to call it la guerre drôle, the funny war, or the droll war, or the lazy war, whatever you want to call it. Others called it the Sitzkrieg, as opposed, instead of the Blitzkrieg, it was a Sitzkrieg, a sit-down war. In England and France, it was called the phony war. There was very little fighting. Now, Hitler had every intention of taking on the USSR. That was going to be his final big fight. He wanted the breadbasket of the Ukraine. He wanted the oil fields of Baku. He wanted to destroy the communists. But he had to widen his base before attacking the Soviet Union. And so he took Denmark and Norway. He invaded them in April of 1940. That gave him more resources, more food, more farmlands, more factories, more conscript labor. Even then, high-placed conspirators in the German general staff made overtures to Great Britain for coordination of efforts. General Oster, Colonel Sass, General Beck, and even Field Marshal Rommel later on.
So Germany was already taking territories. Right? They were already expanding and conquering entire countries in Europe. And the Western powers still wouldn't intervene. They still wouldn't do anything about it. As the Soviet Union was preparing their forces for war and lining up in military positions so that they could strike back against the Nazis.
Warned the British of Hitler's forthcoming, quote, violent, brutal offensive in the West. The British didn't take it serious. The British understood that there was an understanding with the Germans, and they were giving them all this European real estate, and they were finally going to move east and knock off the communist menace. If the British would only guarantee the plotters, the Germans said, a fair peace, they would go at Hitler and overthrow his Nazi regime. The new government would relinquish Czechoslovakia and Poland and everything else except Austria. That was their first offer. London did not even take the offer seriously. In May of 1940, Hitler struck west. He wiped out France and much of the British army at Dunkirk. Then he attacked the Soviet Union in 1941. Stalin had expected it sooner or later. In 1939, Stalin had said, "We have 10 years. In 10 years, we have to do what Britain did in 100 years." And there came the forced industrialization, as Soviet Russia built a whole new industrial base east of the Urals, an industrial base which eventually outproduced Hitler in tanks, planes, and artillery. 80% of the German casualties were on the Eastern Front. The scale and ferocity of the fighting was unparalleled.
80%. 80% of German casualties inflicted by the Soviet Union. It's crazy that that's a real statistic, and these people still try to lie to us and tell us that, you know, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were best buddies. When 80% of German casualties were inflicted by the Soviet Union, who lost 27 million people in the fighting. Like, how does anyone buy into this freaking lie?
Paralleled in the West or in any modern warfare ever. There was nothing in the Western Front that could compare to the Battle of Stalingrad, involving millions of troops. The Battle of Leningrad, where 2.5 million Soviets died. The Battle of Kursk, involving tens of thousands of tanks. The Battle of Warsaw, which took 2 months. The Battle of Berlin, where 3 million Soviet troops were arrayed against 1.5 million German troops, with almost 1 million casualties by both sides. Most discussions in the West about World War II focus on the Western War, which is about 1/5 of the actual war, and ignore the scale and horror and heroism of the Eastern Front. Most discussions in the West about the eve of World War II give us the usual blather about the Hitler-Stalin Pact and say little about the active collaboration of the right-wing Tory government, about the Hitler-Chamberlain Pact. Just as little today is said about the active collaboration of a right-wing U.S. government with fascists throughout the Third World and with Nazis in the Republican Party and in Bush's own campaign.
Just like they don't like to talk about the West collaboration with fascists today. But the West has always loved the fascists when it's convenient for us. They've always loved the Banderites, the Contras, the folks like the Azov Battalion, and even Hitler himself, as long as the fascists are fighting communists or enemies of the U.S.
The fascists are okay because they defend private property and corporate investments. It's the communists that are the menace, according to those who own the world. Those of us who want democracy might want to think about this a little more seriously. This is Michael Parenti for Some Real History.
Man.
That was
Bourgeois historians destroyed by Parenti again. Do you see why that's one of my favorite lectures? Why that's one of my favorite talks that Parenti's ever given? Because it blows apart this common myth that you hear all the time. You hear this myth all the time, dude. Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. World War II nerds in the West won't shut up about it. Why won't they shut up about it? Well, because it's the only piece of evidence that they can take to try and make it seem like the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were buddies. Right? If you looked at any of the other evidence, if you looked at the pact between Hitler and Chamberlain, if you looked at who did the majority of the fighting in World War II, if you looked at the efforts of the Soviet Union to take out Hitler before he launched World War II, it blows apart this nonsensical narrative that communism and fascism are the same, or that they were buddies at the time. It doesn't help the narrative of the liberals. It doesn't help the narrative of people like Paul Massaro, who are trying to convince you that fascism is preferable to communism. And then look at what's going on today. Look at what's going on today in Ukraine. You have the West backing folks like the Azov Battalion and Right Sector and all these Ukrainian fascists to use in a proxy war against Russia, and they're trying to convince you that Russia's the evil one. Putin's the evil one. Not to say Russia is still communist or still socialist today. They are not. But they are going against the U.S.'s economic interests. They are going against the interests of multinational capital and Western finance capital. So, as Parenti said, the U.S. will support fascism in reality versus the potential of socialism. If they feel like there's a potential of Russia moving towards socialism or moving closer to China or moving away from the U.S. dominated economic model or the economic model dominated by Western finance capital, they'll back fascists all day, every step of the way. They don't care. They don't care who they're backing. I mean, time and time again, The U.S. empire has made bedfellows with the most horrific right-wing extremist groups, the most murderous paramilitaries and military groups in the world throughout history. Anything to protect private property, anything to protect Western finance capital. Pinochet, anyone? Exactly. They'll back a guy who murders thousands of communists in his country's national soccer stadium before they let a democratic socialist even get elected in Chile. Salvador Allende ran for election. It wasn't even a revolution. It wasn't even a seizure of power. Allende had run in the 2 elections previous, and due to U.S. involvement and U.S. meddling, he didn't win. And then when he finally came to power, the U.S. started backing the most horrific, murderous fascists imaginable in the Pinochet dictatorship, who would fly communists up in helicopters and push them out the window to their death. Because as Parenti says, the reality of fascism is preferable to the potential of socialism for these monsters. So, the next time somebody brings up the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to you and tries to tell you that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were the same, you show them that lecture by Parenti.